You've been sending us that money every single month without fail, Brooke, and now you're suddenly acting like it's a problem when your sister needs it most. My mother's voice stayed perfectly level across the table, but the edge underneath it was unmistakable. This is your last chance to prove you're still part of this family instead of some detached outsider who only cares about her own little wins. Hi, my name is Brooke Ellison. I am 26 years old. That last chance meeting happened on a crisp Austin morning right before my biggest investor presentation of the year. I had spent the last few years building a strategy consulting practice that helped tech startups scale in the city's exploding scene. The money I sent my parents each month had started as help with their move into the same exclusive gated community where my husband and I lived large sums that covered their expenses and kept my sister's various projects afloat. I never made it a big deal. I was strategic about it, patient figuring boundaries could come later once everyone was stable. My mother had always framed it as the least I could do. My father usually stayed quiet and let her speak. My sister, 3 years younger, treated the transfers like an allowance she had earned simply by existing. None of them had ever built anything themselves. I had. I kept my face neutral while my mother laid out the latest demand. My sister's latest venture was in crisis again, some cash flow emergency that required an immediate large infusion, or everything would collapse. My mother's eyes never left mine as she explained how my refusal would look to the rest of the Enclave. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The cold sarcasm was delivered with the same practiced detachment I had come to expect. I didn't argue. I simply noted the date, the amount, and the fact that the request came right as I was about to close a major deal that would take my firm to the next level. When the meeting ended, I drove straight to the glass tower downtown and delivered the presentation anyway. The investors signed. I felt nothing but the same quiet calculation I always carried these days. Back in the Enclave that evening, my neighbor Caleb Ford waved me down as I pulled into the driveway. Caleb had lived 2 houses over for years and had become friendly with my parents through community events. "Heard your mother mention your sister's situation at the last board meeting," he said, leaning on my car door. "Sounds like she's really struggling." "You doing okay with all of that?" His tone was sympathetic toward them, not me. The message was clear the Enclave was already hearing one side of the story. I thanked him politely and went inside. My husband was in the kitchen reviewing contracts. "Your mother called while you were gone," he said without looking up. "Same script. Your sister needs help. You're being difficult." My husband had watched this pattern long enough to stay calm, but I could see the tension in his jaw. He was the only person who never questioned whose side I was on. The next morning, my work mentor, Natalie Quinn, pulled me into her office at the firm. Natalie had guided me through every major client win and knew the pressure I carried. "Brooke, whatever is happening with your family is leaking into the Enclave group chat. A couple people asked me if you were pulling support again. Focus on the new contracts. You've earned your seat at this table." Her words were practical, but they confirmed the secondary conflict was spreading. Friends and acquaintances in the luxury community were quietly choosing sides, and my mother was shaping the narrative with surgical precision. I spent the following days reviewing my accounts with forensic care. Small, repeated transfers had been routed out over the past several months, secret financial theft using old access credentials and forged authorizations on lines of credit tied to my property in the Enclave. The money had gone straight into accounts linked to my sister's ventures. The pattern was deliberate and hidden behind layers of plausible deniability. My mother had orchestrated it. My sister had benefited. My father had known and stayed silent. I didn't confront them immediately. I was patient, gathering every statement and timestamp. The betrayal felt clinical rather than emotional, another line item in a long ledger of entitlement I had allowed to run unchecked. Then my brother-in-law reached out through a secure channel. My brother-in-law had been married to my sister for several years and had endured the family's casual dismissals of his work in cybersecurity. What no one outside his tight professional circle knew was that he had built a secret empire, a private digital forensics and security consultancy that quietly handled sensitive cases for Austin's highest-profile tech executives. He operated in the shadows, patient and precise, the same way I approached my own business. "I've been running discreet checks since you mentioned the discrepancies," he told me over an encrypted call. "There's more than the transfers. Your mother kept physical records, forgotten diary pages, and I recovered an old recording from a backup device she thought was wiped. It's them discussing the forgeries in detail." He sent the files that night. The diary pages written in my mother's careful handwriting laid out the plan, step by step, how they would use outdated access I had once given them for emergencies, how they would route the money so it looked legitimate, how they would lean on the Enclave's social pressure if I pushed back. The recording was even clearer, my mother's voice stating calmly that I was too distracted with my little consulting wins to notice, and my sister laughing in agreement that Brooke owes us this. I listened to the recording once, then saved it without reaction. The cold detachment I had cultivated for years simply locked into place more firmly. The Enclave community board meeting was scheduled for the end of the week. My mother had already hinted in group messages that she would address ongoing family support issues publicly if I continued to be unreasonable. Caleb had forwarded me one of the threads where several neighbors echoed concern about my sister's crisis and my apparent lack of empathy. My aunt and uncle had added their voices, painting me as the one creating unnecessary drama. I sat in my home office overlooking the hills, the files from my brother-in-law open on my screen. My husband stood behind me, one hand on my shoulder. "Whatever you decide," he said quietly, "we do it together." I closed the laptop. The recording and diary pages were the mid-story twist I hadn't seen coming, but they fit the pattern perfectly. My mother had never viewed the money as mine. She had viewed it as family property she controlled through guilt and social leverage. The theft was simply the logical extension of that belief. The board meeting was 3 days away. I knew exactly what my mother planned to do there, turn the entire luxury community against me in one calculated performance. Friends who had once invited us to events would now look at me with the same cold judgment she had cultivated. I didn't feel anger. I felt the quiet, empowered resolve of someone who had finally seen the full ledger. The next morning, I sat at my dining table with the blinds half drawn against the Texas sun, reviewing the files my brother-in-law had sent. The forgotten diary pages were written in my mother's precise handwriting, dated over the last 18 months, listing every transfer she had authorized under my name, using the old credentials I had once shared for family emergencies only. The old recording captured a conversation between my mother and my father in their living room, her voice calm and matter-of-fact, as she explained how they would reroute the funds into my sister's accounts without raising flags. My sister's laugh in the background was the only part that carried any warmth at all. My brother-in-law joined us via video from his downtown office, his face expressionless on the screen. "The evidence is airtight," he said, "but the Enclave board has already started circulating the narrative your mother planted." Caleb forwarded me the latest group thread this morning. My husband stood behind me, arms crossed, saying nothing. He knew I didn't need comfort. I needed clarity. I saved everything to an encrypted drive and closed the laptop. "We wait." I told them both. "She wants a scene. I want the record to speak first." That afternoon, my mother called. I answered on the second ring, keeping my tone even. "You're still ignoring my messages, Brooke?" She said, the words clipped but perfectly controlled. "The board meeting is in 2 days. People are asking questions about why you're suddenly withholding support when your sister's entire project is on the line. This is your last chance to fix this before the whole Enclave sees exactly what kind of daughter you've become." I listened without interrupting. Her voice carried that familiar cold sarcasm, the one she reserved for moments when she believed she still held the upper hand. "You've always been so strategic about your little consulting career," she continued, "building your reputation one client at a time while the rest of us actually live in the real world. But family doesn't work like a spreadsheet. You either step up now or everyone here will know you chose yourself over your own blood. Again." I let the silence stretch just long enough for her to feel it. "I have the records," I said, finally, voice flat. "The diary pages, the recording, every unauthorized transfer." She laughed once short and sharp. "Records can be disputed, Brooke. Memories and community opinion cannot. Think about that before you walk into that meeting and embarrass all of us." The call ended. I set the phone down without reaction. My husband glanced at me. "She's escalating fast." "She always does when the leverage slips," I replied. The following day, Natalie pulled me aside after our morning strategy session at the firm. "The Enclave chat is blowing up," she said quietly. "Caleb mentioned it to me at the community gym this morning. Several neighbors are saying your mother reached out privately, framing this as you abandoning your sister during a legitimate business setback. They're not asking questions anymore. They're choosing sides." I nodded once. Caleb had been friendly for years, the kind of neighbor who waved when we passed on morning runs. Now he was part of the secondary conflict, feeding the narrative without ever confronting me directly. It was efficient. My mother had always excelled at that. I spent the rest of the day finalizing client deliverables, answering emails with the same detached precision I used for everything else. My work had never suffered because of family pressure. I had made sure of it, but the quiet knowledge that lifelong acquaintances in the gated hills were now viewing me through my mother's lens added a new layer of isolation. Friends I had known since we moved into the Enclave, people who had attended our housewarmings and shared weekend brunches, were suddenly distant in the group threads. My aunt had even posted a vague comment about the importance of supporting family through tough times, which my uncle had liked immediately. That evening, my father texted a single message. I read it once and deleted it. It was the same script my mother had always fed him: disappointment, obligation, the subtle threat of social fallout. I didn't reply. The night before the board meeting, my brother-in-law called again. I have secured the physical copies of the diary pages through a contact who handles document forensics for high net worth clients, he said. They'll hold up if it goes legal. The recording has been authenticated, but your mother scheduled a pre-meeting coffee with 3 board members tomorrow morning. She's not waiting for the official agenda. I thanked him and ended the call. My husband and I reviewed the evidence one last time at the kitchen island, the city lights of Austin glittering beyond the windows. I wasn't nervous. I was prepared. The patient strategy I had built my entire career on was now turned inward, protecting what I had earned. The morning of the board meeting arrived clear and cool. I dressed in the same tailored navy suit I wore for major client pitches, nothing flashy, nothing that could be twisted into showing off. My husband drove us to the community clubhouse in silence. As we pulled into the parking lot, I saw Caleb's car already there, along with several other familiar vehicles. My mother's SUV sat in the prime spot near the entrance. We walked in together. The large meeting room was already half full, the usual mix of Enclave residents in casual luxury attire, clustered near the coffee station. My mother stood at the front table speaking quietly with 2 board members. Her posture relaxed, her smile practiced. My father sat a few rows back, arms folded. My sister wasn't present. She rarely bothered with these meetings unless there was direct benefit. Caleb caught my eye from across the room and gave a small nod, the kind that said he had already made up his mind. Natalie had slipped in at the back row just minutes before her presence. A quiet anchor I hadn't asked for, but appreciated all the same. The board president, a man named Richard Lang, whom I had only ever seen at these meetings, cleared his throat again and gestured for me to speak when the time came. I connected my phone to the room's audio system with the same calm precision I used in client pitches. Before anyone decides whose story to believe, I said my voice flat, and even you should hear this. I pressed play. The recording filled the room, my mother's voice, unmistakable, explaining in careful detail how they had used the old access credentials to pull funds without my knowledge. My father's occasional grunt of agreement, my sister's light laugh in the background when my mother called my consulting work a convenient distraction. The words landed like facts, not drama, no shouting, no tears, just the cold mechanics of what they had done. The recording ended. Silence pressed down on the entire room. My mother's face remained composed, but I saw the brief tightening at the corners of her mouth. She stepped forward before anyone else could react, her tone still perfectly controlled. "That's taken completely out of context, Brooke," she said, the sarcasm thin but present. "You've always been so quick to document everything for your little business deals. Family matters aren't spreadsheets. We were simply helping your sister through a temporary shortfall while you focused on yourself." Again. My father nodded from his seat, arms still folded, the same silent backing he had given her for years. Caleb leaned toward the woman beside him and murmured something I couldn't hear, but the shift in his posture told me the Enclave's default loyalty was cracking. A few other neighbors exchanged glances, the kind that said the story they had been fed no longer fit. I opened the briefcase and laid printed copies of the forgotten diary pages on the table in front of the board. These are dated entries in my mother's handwriting, transfers routed through accounts I never authorized beyond basic emergencies. The amounts match exactly what disappeared from my lines of credit over the last 18 months. My brother-in-law has already verified the digital trail through his firm. The evidence is documented and time-stamped. Richard Lang picked up the top page, scanned it, and set it down with visible discomfort. Natalie stepped forward quietly and spoke for the first time. As someone who has worked with Brooke on every major contract she's closed, I can confirm the financial impact this has had on her practice. This isn't about family support, it's about unauthorized access and deliberate concealment. My mother's laugh was short and sharp, the same one I had heard on the recording. My brother-in-law, the one who barely shows his face at community events. Of course he would back you. This is exactly the kind of division you create, Brooke. Turning people against their own family in public, the Enclave has watched you pull away for years while we tried to keep everyone together. She turned to the room, eyes sweeping the faces she had cultivated for so long. We've all seen how hard your sister has worked on her projects. If Brooke chooses to withhold help, now that's her decision. But don't let one edited recording rewrite years of support we've given her. The secondary conflict hung thick in the air. Several neighbors who had messaged me privately in the past week now looked away, the weight of the evidence clashing with the narrative my mother had built. Caleb finally spoke, his voice hesitant. "Susan, I thought this was just a misunderstanding, but those pages? They look pretty clear." My mother's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room dropped. She fixed her gaze on me again. "You really want to do this here in front of everyone who matters in this enclave? You'll destroy more than just our relationship. People remember who causes scenes like this. I met her eyes without blinking. I remember the transfers. I remember the diary entries. And I remember that family is not ownership." The board president called for a short recess. In the hallway outside, my mother cornered me while my husband stood a few feet away, silent but present. My father hovered behind her, his usual quiet support now looking more like uncertainty. "You think those papers mean anything," she said, voice low enough that only we could hear. "The Enclave knows us. They know what kind of daughter walks away when her sister needs her. You'll lose every connection you have here. Caleb already told me he's rethinking his friendship with you after the way you've handled this." I kept my posture straight, the same detached calm I had maintained through every escalation. The connections were never mine to begin with, if they were built on what you took without asking. My brother-in-law arrived 10 minutes later carrying a slim folder from his firm. He had moved quietly in the background for weeks, his secret empire of digital forensics and high-level security work providing the exact leverage we needed. No one in the Enclave had ever suspected the quiet brother-in-law was the one executives called when they needed problems erased or trails followed. He handed the folder to Richard Lang without fanfare. "Preliminary legal notice of unauthorized financial activity," my brother-in-law said simply. "The firm has already flagged the accounts with the necessary authorities. The transfers triggered automatic reviews once the discrepancies were formally reported. Consequences will follow their own timeline." My mother's mask slipped for the first time, not rage, something colder, a realization that the patient strategy I had used against her had finally closed the loop. My father looked at my brother-in-law with the same dismissive expression he had always worn, but it carried less weight now. The board meeting reconvened briefly. Richard Lang announced that the personal matter would be handled privately going forward, but the damage was done. The recording and diary pages had shifted the room. Caleb approached me afterward, his earlier sympathy toward my mother replaced by awkward discomfort. "I had no idea it went this deep," he said. A lot of us didn't. Other neighbors who had echoed my mother's messages in the group chat now offered stiff nods or avoided eye contact entirely. Lifelong acquaintances in the Enclave, the ones I had shared brunches and community events with for years, were already distancing themselves, the friendships dissolving under the weight of the evidence. That evening at home, my husband poured 2 glasses of water and set them on the kitchen island. We didn't speak much. There was nothing left to analyze. My brother-in-law joined us later via call, confirming that the legal process had begun in earnest. The unauthorized transfers were now under formal review. My mother and my father would face the slow, impersonal machinery of financial accountability, frozen lines, required repayments, and the quiet erosion of their standing in the community they had weaponized against me. I blocked every number the next morning. My mother, my father, my sister, the extended relatives who had piled on in the group threads. No dramatic final message, no last chance, just the clean cut I had prepared for months. Weeks passed in the same measured rhythm I had always kept. The firm continued to grow. Natalie checked in once, offering quiet support without prying. Caleb sent one awkward text apologizing for the way things had unfolded, but I didn't reply. The Enclave felt smaller now the friendships I had thought were real revealed as conditional on my mother's version of events. They chose the narrative that kept their world comfortable. I chose the boundary that kept mine intact. My brother-in-law officially stepped into a consulting role with my practice a month later, his expertise in secure systems adding another layer of protection I hadn't realized I needed until the theft. My husband and I hosted a small dinner on the balcony overlooking the hills. Nothing extravagant, just the three of us. The city lights stretched out below, steady and indifferent to the drama that had played out in the gated streets above. I never regretted the silence that followed. My mother tried one final outreach through a mutual acquaintance, framing it as concern for family unity. I declined the conversation. The money I had sent for years stopped the moment the evidence surfaced. The property adjustments and accounts were resolved through the proper channels, restoring what belonged to me without further negotiation. Looking back now, the betrayal had never been about the specific transfers or the recording or even the Enclave's shifting opinions. It was about the assumption that my success, my time, my resources existed to serve their needs first. Family is not ownership. I had finally drawn the line with the same strategic patience I used in every other part of my life, and the freedom that followed was absolute. Boundaries create freedom. I learned that the hard way, but I learned it completely. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever watched someone you trusted treat your hard work like it was theirs to take, how much disrespect do you tolerate before you stop sending the money, stop answering the calls, and simply walk away for good? I'd really like to know what that line looks like for you.